All right, let's take a look at the second section. Here we go. Dwight D. Eisenhower, known as Ike, was the most popular military leader to emerge from World War II. Eisenhower supported Truman's candidacy for president in 1948, and in 1952, both parties wanted Eisenhower as their candidate. But Eisenhower believed that a contender for the Republican nomination, Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio, would turn America back to isolationism, and Eisenhower gained the Republican nomination. He chose as his running mate Richard Nixon of California, who, as a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, had achieved notoriety through his anti-communist activism, particularly against Alger Hiss. Nixon won a Senate seat in 1950 by suggesting that his Democratic opponent sympathized with communism. Though Nixon thus gained a reputation for opportunism and dishonesty, he was also a skillful politician who led efforts to change the Republican Party's image from defender of business to a champion of the forgotten man, the hardworking citizen, burdened by heavy taxes and government bureaucracy. In using populist language to promote free market economies, Nixon helped to lay the foundation for the triumph of conservatism a generation later. As soon as he got the vice presidential nomination, Nixon ran into trouble and Eisenhower almost dropped him off the ticket. However, Nixon was able to use television in his Checkers speech to convince Americans that the family dog Checkers was the only gift he had received and was not returning. The speech rescued Nixon's career and illustrated the change TV was making in the political process. The 1952 presidential campaign was the first to show how television changed politics, as candidates crafted images that were projected directly into Americans' living rooms. Eisenhower's popularity dominated the election, however, and public frustration with the Korean War, along with Eisenhower's pledge to bring peace, won him an overwhelming victory over Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic candidate. 4 years later, Eisenhower again bested Stevenson by an even larger margin. But the Republicans did not gain power in Congress, and in 1954, the Democrats regained control of Congress and held it for the rest of the 1950s. Significantly, Eisenhower made major inroads in the Democratic South, but Democrats continued to control almost all Southern state and local offices. Voters across the world elected familiar and elder leaders to govern them, such as Winston Churchill, made prime minister in England again, and Charles de Gaulle in France. Eisenhower, at 62, was one of the oldest men ever elected president. In retrospect, Eisenhower's tenure as president seems almost uneventful, at least in domestic affairs, an interlude between the party battles of Truman's administration and the social upheavals of the 1960s. With the Republican president after a long period of Democratic control, business once again heavily influenced Washington and the executive branch. Eisenhower, an ally of business and a fiscal conservative, worked to reduce government spending, including the military budget. But while some Republicans wanted to roll back the New Deal, Ike knew this would be political suicide. Ike's domestic agenda, called modern republicanism, was intended to end the Republicans' association with Herbert Hoover, the Great Depression, and social indifference. Under Eisenhower, New Deal programs expanded and the size of the government grew. Free enterprise may have been a potent American weapon in the Cold War, but the mixed economy, in which government played a role in planning economic activity, was popular in the West. The U.S. allies Britain and France expanded welfare and nationalized key industries like steel, shipbuilding, and transportation, but the United States had a smaller welfare state than Western Europe and left major industries in private hands, while government spending, such as the creation of an interstate highway system, boosted productivity and employment. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial Earth satellite in 1957, the administration responded with the National Defense Education Act, which offered direct federal funding to higher education. Rather than dismantling the New Deal, modern republicanism consolidated and legitimized it, which made the New Deal's survival guaranteed regardless of which party held the White House. The 1950s also saw stability in labor relations. The 1947 Taft-Hartley Act reduced labor militancy, and in 1955, the AFL and CIO merged into one organization representing 35% of all non-farm workers. In key industries, labor and management established what had been called a new social contract. Unions left decisions about capital investment, plant location, and output to managers and agreed to suppress unauthorized wildcat strikes in return for employers' acceptance of unions, wage increases, and fringe benefits like private pensions, health insurance, and automatic adjustments to cover rises in living costs. Though unionized workers shared in the 1950s prosperity, the social contract applied to few workers. Unions want increases in the minimum wage, but they did little for non-union workers in this period. Most workers did not enjoy the wages and benefits of union workers. Non-union employers continued to combat labor unions, and some firms still moved production to the cheaper non-union South. a 1959 strike provoked by steel companies in an attempt to reduce the union's power over production. However, by the 1960s, the social contract was weakening. Once elected, Eisenhower quickly ended the Korean War, but Cold War tensions increased. In 1952, the United States exploded the first hydrogen bomb, which was far more destructive than the atom bomb. The next year, the Soviets had the hydrogen bomb too, and both powers built long-range bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons across the globe. Although Eisenhower was a professional soldier who hated war, his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, relished it. In 1954, Dulles updated U.S. containment policy with his doctrine of massive retaliation. This policy stated that any Soviet attack on a U.S. ally would be met with a nuclear assault on the Soviet Union. This new focus on nuclear weapons led Eisenhower to reduce spending on conventional military forces. During his presidency, the size of the armed forces dropped while the number of nuclear weapons increased dramatically to 18,000 in 1960. Massive retaliation ran the risk that even a small conflict might rapidly escalate into a nuclear war that would destroy the United States and the Soviet Union. Critics called it brinksmanship, but the reality that war would result in mutually assured destruction, or MAD, made the United States and Russia more cautious. It also spread fear of an imminent nuclear war. Government's appeals to build bomb shelters in backyards and school drills where students hid under their desks were meant to convince Americans that they could survive a nuclear war, but these only increased widespread fear. Though Eisenhower embraced Cold War rhetoric, he believed that the Korean War's end and Stalin's death in 1953 signaled that the Soviets were reasonable and could be reached through normal diplomacy. In 1955, he met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Switzerland. The next year, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes at a Moscow Communist Party Congress. These revelations sparked a crisis of belief and confidence in communists worldwide, including the United States, where most remaining members of the Communist Party abandoned it. That same year, Khrushchev called for peaceful coexistence with the United States. But this thaw in the Cold War ended when Soviet troops suppressed an anti-communist revolt in Hungary in 1956. While some Republicans called for liberating Europe, Ike did not aid the Hungarian rebels. He did not believe it was possible to roll back Soviet power in Eastern Europe. In 1958, the U.S. and the USSR agreed to halt nuclear weapons tests, and this lasted until 1961. In 1959, Khrushchev even toured the United States and met with Eisenhower. But in 1960, tensions returned when the Soviets shot down a U.S. spy plane over Soviet territory. Even though the Cold War divided Europe into communist and capitalist regions without war, it sparked competition and military conflict in what came to be called the Third World. The term was used to describe developing countries aligned with neither the U.S. nor the Russians that wanted to develop their economies without central government planning or free market capitalism. The Bandung Conference, held in Indonesia in 1955, announced the emergence of a new force representing a majority of the world's population. However, none of these nations escaped Cold War competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. In the post-war period, Europe's empires crumbled. Decolonization in Asia and Africa began when India and Pakistan achieved independence in 1947. In the late 1950s, other new nations such as Ghana, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, and Kenya followed. In 1975, even Portugal, which had created Europe's first modern overseas empire, gave independence to its African colonies, Mozambique and Angola. Facing decolonization, the U.S. feared that power vacuums in the former colonies would be penetrated by Soviet-allied communists. The Soviets supported the dissolution of Europe's colonial empires, and communists participated in national movements for independence. Leaders of new nations often saw socialism in one form or another as the best means to economic independence and narrowing social inequalities created by imperialism. While most new Third World nations sided with neither power, the U.S. was admired by many nationalists for its own struggle for colonial independence. Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of Vietnam's movement to end French rule there, modeled his 1945 Declaration of Nationhood on the Declaration of Independence. By the end of the 1950s, the division of Europe seemed to be set in stone. So much of the focus of the Cold War shifted to the Third World. The policy of containment was used to justify opposition to governments, whether they were communist or not. Two world leaders, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman in Guatemala and Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, were both popularly elected nationalists free of Soviet influence. Because of both leaders' interest in land reform and quelling foreign investment, they were branded as communists, and the CIA overthrew both governments in 1953 and 1954. In 1956, Israel, France, and Britain invaded Egypt after Gamal Abdel Nasser, the nationalist leader, nationalized the Suez Canal. This invasion enraged Eisenhower, who forced them to abandon the mission and began the replacement of Britain with the U.S. as the main Western power in the Middle East. The shift also brought American companies to invest in the region's oil fields. In 1957, the Eisenhower Doctrine expanded the policy of containment to the Middle Eastern countries threatened by communism or Arab nationalism. In a test of his doctrine, Eisenhower dispatched 5,000 American troops to Lebanon to protect Nasser's efforts uh, to bring all Arab states into a single regime under his rules. In Vietnam in 1945, when the Japanese were expelled, the French moved to crush a national independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh and reassert its colonial rule. Anti-communism pulled the U.S. deeper into involvement in Southeast Asia. Following a policy set by Truman, Eisenhower gave billions of dollars in aid for French efforts, and by the early 1950s, the U.S. was paying for 4/5 of the cost of France's war in Vietnam. But Eisenhower did not send U.S. troops in 1954 when French forces were on the verge of defeat. Rejecting National Security Council advice to use nuclear weapons, Eisenhower left France no choice but to concede Vietnamese independence. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam temporarily into northern and southern districts, with elections in 1956 set to unify the country. But the anti-communist southern leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, at the suggestion of the U.S., refused to hold elections which both parties knew would result in communist victory. Diem's Catholicism and his ties to landlords in a country of small farmers and Buddhists alienated many Vietnamese, and only U.S. aid let his regime survive. By 1960, Diem faced a guerrilla war launched by the communist-led National Liberation Front. Events in Guatemala, Iran, and Vietnam set a trend in U.S. foreign relations. The U.S. became accustomed to intervention, both overt and covert, throughout the world. Despite the Cold War language of freedom, U.S. leaders again and again allied with military regimes rather than democratic governments. In Guatemala, a series of military regimes ended Arbenz's reforms. In Iran, the Shah replaced Prime Minister Mossadegh and gave U.S. and British companies 40% of Iranian oil revenues. The Shah remained in office until the 1979 revolution ushered in a radical Islamic nationalist government. In Vietnam, U.S. support for Diem led to the most disastrous war in U.S. history. Despite the apparent rule of consensus in American society, in which McCarthyism made criticism of the status quo seem disloyal, freedom seemed to be located in the private enjoyment of consumer goods, and political debate was narrowed by the Cold War. Dissent, however, did exist. Some intellectuals thought that affluence and the Cold War mentality obscured the degree to which the U.S. did not live up to its own ideal of freedom. In 1957, the political scientist Hans Morgenthau argued that free enterprise had created new accumulations of power that threatened individual liberty. The sociologist C. Wright Mills challenged the idea that democratic pluralism defined American life and argued that America was ruled by a power elite, an interlocking directorate of corporate leaders, politicians, and military men who dominated government and society, making political democracy obsolete and denying real freedom of choice to Americans. Some argued that modernity itself produced psychological and cultural discontent, and they worried that mass society produced a loneliness and anxiety that made people desire not freedom, but authority and stability. Social scientists and critics argued that Americans were conformists who were unable to be independent thinkers and actors, and that corporate bureaucracies turned employees into organization men incapable of independent thought. Other critics worried that Americans had lost their commitment to the common good. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith, in The Affluent Society from 1958, wondered how American society could neglect investment in schools, parks, and public services while producing ever more goods to satisfy consumer desires. Other books criticized the monotony of modern work, the emptiness of suburban life, and the influence of advertising. But this social and cultural critique did little to transform American life in the 1950s. These critics did not offer a political alternative or influence party politics or government. But with a very large and growing young population, thanks to the baby boom, popular culture revealed tensions beneath the quiet surface of 1950s life. J.D. Salinger's novel Catcher in the Rye and films like Rebel Without a Cause emphasized the alienation of youth from the adult world. Such works stimulated adult fears of widespread juvenile delinquency and led even comic book publishers to regulate their publications. Indeed, cultural life was more daring than politics. Teenagers wore leather jackets and danced to rock and roll music that brought the hard rhythms and sexually provocative movements of black musicians and dancers to white audiences, embodied by none more so than the extremely popular Elvis Presley. The debut of magazines like Playboy openly flaunted a fantasy world of sexuality for men outside the family, and gay men and lesbians, though considered deviant by the larger society, established their own subcultures in America's major cities. In New York, San Francisco, and small college towns, the Beats, a small group of poets and writers, rebelled against mainstream culture. The term beat, invented by the novelist Jack Kerouac, signified beaten down and beatified or saint like. His book On the Road, written in the early 1950s but not published until 1957, captured the aimless wanderings of the main character across America and offered a spontaneous series of sights, sounds, and images. The book captivated a generation of young people who rejected middle class life but offered no alternative to it. Likewise, Allen Ginsberg's Howl from 1955, written while the author was taking hallucinogenic drugs, was a sprawling poem that railed against materialism and conformism. The Beats rejected the work ethic, suburban middle class materialism, and the Cold War's militarization of American life. They celebrated impulsive action, immediate gratification, often enhanced by drugs, and sexual experimentation. So that's the end of the second section. We'll be back for the third.